If I was to say there's 1.5 million people who are legally homeless in England, you'd probably think I was absolutely nuts. But I actually don't think I am. I'm going to try and explain why I think it is that number and how that is actually most likely a conservative number rather than a more plausible one. In order to understand what I'm talking about here, when you ask members of the public, generally if you say how many people are homeless in England, they'll immediately think about rough sleeping, and if they've got a good memory they might think back to various news reports done on the annual rough sleeper estimates, which give it about sort of 4,000 or so. But the reality is that there are far more people who are legally homeless. The biggest group of people will be people who have their own home, but for some reason it's not reasonable to continue to occupy that home. And just to head a few people off at the pass, housing law is predominantly enacted by Conservative governments, so this is not some liberal woke sort of nonsense. This is Conservatives working out what's best for our country, often in financial terms, but that's not necessarily the worst way to do it. Obviously there is a massive human cost as well, but even if you just look at it in terms of lost taxes and stuff like that, it becomes a real issue for our country and one that is entirely fixable. So to understand the figures I'm putting forward here, there's a few things I guess it's worth saying at this point. One is that the current population of England is something like 58 million people, obviously adults and children, and there is an average of 2.2 people per household, because often the figures I'm getting from the various sources I'm using actually quote the number of households rather than the number of people living there. Obviously from our point of view it's the people that matters rather than the number of households. And just to say, when I'm talking about these different figures, I will put a source in the description of the video, so I'll put a number up on the screen or something, and then in the description I'll give the link to it. You can go and find this stuff out for yourself. Wherever possible I've used government stats or the ONS or whatever rather than anything else. In most cases I was able to get fairly helpful figures from the government websites, but there are a few bits I have to kind of stray offline a little bit, and there's a few figures, things like sofa surfing, which I just had to kind of do my own maths on really, which you can disregard if you want. But if we start looking at the law which governs this, section 175 of the Housing Act 1996, you have to remember that, basically states that there are three groups of people who are homeless. One are those who don't have anywhere with a legal right to occupy. Secondly are those people who might have been illegally evicted or don't have somewhere to put their caravan, something like that. But then the third subgroup is the most important, because these are the people who have a home of some description, but for whatever reason it is not reasonable to continue to occupy. And that term is key, you'll see it elsewhere in the law. We're talking here about people who are at current risk of domestic abuse. We're talking about people who maybe have unsanitary conditions they're living in, disrepair issues and so on. You're going to have people who just genuinely can't afford their rent, people whose mobility issues mean that it's not suitable for them living there, all of those kind of things, which is what I'm going to try and pick apart. So I'm not just kind of giving a random figure of 1.5 million. There is a reason why I'm arriving at that figure, and there's a reason why I'm saying that's an underestimate almost certainly. So if we look at a few bits and pieces to start off with, maybe the least controversial figures I'm using here are the ones which are actually very accurate, which are the number of people in temporary accommodation provided by local authorities across England. Every quarter in England, local authorities are supposed to give some stats around the people they are helping, both those in temporary accommodation and those who are not. And although there are some councils that don't provide these figures every time, they're pretty good, they're pretty solid. And at the moment there are judged to be 120,000 households in England which are in temporary accommodation. Bearing in mind here we're talking about households rather than people. It doesn't actually say the number of people directly, but there are some clues and a bit of maths we can do to work out a fairly accurate figure. So the total number of households is then broken down into the number of households with and without children. And if you do the maths on it, you'll find that there are 44,000 households without children that are in temporary accommodation. Now, that does not mean to say there are 44,000 individuals, because some of them will be couples without children or potentially parents with adult children, something like that. So although the 44,000 figure is our conservative figure and the one we'll take forward, I would say it's pretty safe to say there's going to be 50,000 people in that category. And then that leaves the families with children, and again there's no exact number, but if we do a little bit of maths, we look at the number of children in TA which is recorded, and then we assume that there's at least one adult per household, which is a pretty safe assumption to make. We arrive at a figure of 237,000, but as I say, a significant number of those households will have two adults in them, so I think plausibly we could go with 260,000. So our conservative figure is 237,000, plausible figure 260,000 as a way going forward. We then get to sleeping rough, which, as I say, is often the thing people think of when they think of homelessness for obvious reasons, partly because charities feed the media, which then feed, kind of public opinion, and a lot of charities only focus on rough sleeping as if it's the only type of homelessness. And every year in England, local authorities are supposed to give a figure back to central government of the number of people who are sleeping rough on a typical night. It uses a controversial methodology because when they came up with this methodology, it was never supposed to be actually accurately predicting the number of people who are homeless. It was supposed to be an objective baseline which could then predict trends, whether rough sleeping was going up or not. But every year charities report on the actual number as if it's the real number. We all know it's higher than the number that's estimated, because the estimate uses a very strict definition of rough sleeping, as in, often you have to find people in a sleeping bag to actually count them. Whereas obviously a lot of people who are rough sleeping will be off grid, they'll be kind of in cars or whatever, and they will not be counted in the official figure. So although the official figure is something like 4,000, a little over 4,000 at the moment, I'm going to advance a plausible figure of 10,000. I think most people in the sector would probably say that's, even then, it's kind of quite conservative as a way to go forward. So that's the number of rough sleepers. And then sofa surfing. There are, as far as I know, no reliable figures or estimates of the number of people sofa surfing. So this is one where I'm going a little bit off piste, and I'm using my own experience. I've worked in Bedford Homelessness Services for 20 years. I've got to know a lot of people in that time. And I am estimating that in Bedford Borough, which is a population of about 180,000, there are at least 100 people sofa surfing at any one time. There's probably many more than that. But as I say, I'm going to try and be conservative here. So let's say there was 100 people in Bedford Borough. If we were then to extrapolate up to the population of England, we're going to get something like 31,000 people sofa surfing at any one time. I'm going to say plausibly it's probably high, almost certainly higher. So I'm going to say 50,000 as a plausible number, but ultimately we don't know. And my logic here to look at this is to say that there's almost certainly going to be more people sofa surfing than there are rough sleeping. Because the sort of nature of homelessness means you kind of got this pyramid of kind of risks, so you've got people who are kind of unaffordable accommodation, then of them, some of them drop through to sofa surfing, of them, some of them drop through to rough sleeping. So again, I'm trying to be sensible here. I think that figure is going to be an underestimate. So those are people who are going to make up that first category of legal homelessness, the people who don't have a legal right to occupy anywhere. If we skip down to the third category and look at the number of people who have a home but it's unreasonable to continue to occupy, we are going to find some very big numbers here very quickly. So if we start with domestic abuse, again, these stats are very problematic for a number of reasons. And although there are some fairly good stats on, for example, the number of adults who report domestic abuse every year, that does not mean to say that all of them will be homeless. I think a lot of them will be, as I'll explain, but we can't obviously take that figure of 2.3 million, for example, which is the reported figure I see in the ONS, and say that all of them are homeless. But there are some things we can say. And first thing I would say is that actually, because it's the number of adults who are reporting domestic abuse, their children will also be homeless if they're in that situation. Now again, I'm using here the average household size of 2.2. It's a rather clumsy mechanism. So if we were to multiply the number of adults by 2.2 and then subtract again the 2.3 million of them, I hope that makes sense why I'm doing that. Because presumably you've got a parent who's a victim, and you presumably got a parent or a family member who's a perpetrator. And so again, that's a rather messy way of doing it, but I think that kind of just recognises the fact that the actual number of people caught up in those stats will be higher than the 2.3 million that's reported. And just to say as well, out of those 2.3 million reports of domestic abuse, some of them will be genuinely one-off cases. Probably not very often, to be honest, but technically that's possible, so I'm going to say it. And you're also going to get people who are basically making counterclaims. So where you've got a genuine perpetrator who is then claiming to be the victim. And again, it's impossible from these figures to really know what's what here. You've also got people who are going to be in refuges. So I looked at the Women's Aid website and I looked at the Mankind website, and essentially there are something like 24,000 people in refuges, vast majority of them female parents, that is, children obviously 50-50 male and female, and a small number of males in refuges. If we take this figure of something like 2.7 million people who are either at risk of domestic abuse themselves or their children, and if we look at the test of homelessness here, in terms of it not being reasonable to continue to occupy, we're looking at people who have a home where it's probable the abuse is likely to going to continue, if that makes sense. Those are the ones who are captured under Section 177 of the Housing Act. Those are the ones who are homeless. And just to make the point, you don't need to flee your home to be legally homeless. You are already legally homeless if you're in your own home, even if you own your own home, just to make that point. But it's likely that the abuse will continue. That's a sort of a clumsy way of saying it. And so in terms of the number I want to put forward here, I'm going to say conservatively that there are 500,000 people who are going to be homeless through domestic abuse. I think, even conservatively, you could go higher than that. So I would say a plausible figure is 1 million at least. So again, I'm going to kind of do the calculations for both types to see where we end up. So that's domestic abuse. We've then got overcrowding. Now again, most people who are overcrowded won't be homeless. There is a legal definition of overcrowding. In fact, there's at least a couple. But just because you're overcrowded doesn't mean you're homeless. But obviously a small proportion of those total households who will be overcrowded, it will not be reasonable to continue to occupy because they're like, 3 or 4 people over the limit. There's no kind of clear-cut test of it, by the way. And it is a test which varies around the country. So for example, it's harder to be overcrowded in Tower Hamlets than it is to be in a leafy suburb like Central Beds or something, just because it's a comparative test that the councils use. But according to, again, government website here, 708,000 properties are overcrowded in 2023, and in my view it'd be silly here just to multiply it by 2.2 to find the number of people affected by it, because obviously by nature of overcrowding we're going to be talking about much larger households. So I'm actually going to multiply that figure by 4. That gives us 2.8 million people, which I think is safe to say are in overcrowded accommodation. And let's say 2% of that total are legally homeless. That would give us a figure of about 56,000. That would be a conservative figure, I think. And then plausibly, if we go the figure of 5% of that figure, we're going to get 141,000. Again, that's not exactly very scientific, I appreciate, but I think it's certainly a ballpark figure, which is obviously what I'm trying to do here. So that's overcrowding. Similarly, you've got unaffordability, which is massive. Who knows how big it is. Cost of living crisis has been going on for years now. And again, just piecing some stats I was able to find out, again, from government or ONS where possible. I think as the government here was saying, 1.9 million private renters rely on universal credit for their rent or housing benefit if they're still on legacy benefits. And again, the average household size is 2.2, so that would be something like 4.1 million people are in households which are reliant on universal credit, and 85% of those rents are not covered by the local housing allowance. That is to say, there is a shortfall between the person's income from universal credit for the housing element towards the rent. And I'd say at this point as well, because I know, again, people just get really annoyed about this sort of stuff, that money goes to private landlords. It does not go to the households. They're not like any better off. They're not saving up loads of money for this. It is basically going through them to the private landlords. So it's not the case that they're just all getting massively rich off benefits. It just goes straight to the landlords. That's just not the way it works. So 85% of that 4.1 million would be 3.5 million. And unfortunately with this, the law is not very helpful right now. There was a really clear-cut case back in 2018. It was a Supreme Court case, Samuels v Birmingham. And in that case, effectively what the judge said was, when you work out if someone can afford their rent, looking at the amount of money they're getting from universal credit should be kind of the default position. So if they're having to top up their rent from what's supposed to go towards, kind of food, electric, clothes, that sort of thing, then they're already legally homeless. Unfortunately, around the same time, the Homelessness Code of Guidance wording changed a bit, and there's been some other cases more recently which muddy the water quite a lot. So I think it's safe to say that 2 million of those 3.5 million would be homeless. Now, there'll actually be other people as well that I'm not including here, so people who potentially own their own home, but basically, maybe kind of their income has dropped massively and they can't afford it and that sort of thing. But 2 million, I think, is a conservative number, and I'd say plausibly 3 million. Given that the current case law on affordability hasn't departed that much from that Samuels case, although it has, as I say, made it a little bit more ambiguous. We've then got unsuitability because of medical needs. So one website I was looking at, which again kind of gave low figures, said that 374,000 households considered their own home to be unsuitable. Now that is only their assessment of it, I appreciate, so it may not be the statutory kind of standard that's been put on those kind of opinions. But if we multiply that by 2.2, the average household size, we get 820,000. And again, I'm going to go here with kind of conservative number of 100,000 people who are in their own home, but because of the nature of their disability and because they haven't got adaptations been made, they are legally homeless. And plausibly, I would say 500,000, because again, it's pretty stark a lot of the time. We've got people in wheelchairs who need to go upstairs to get to the bathroom and they can't, and there's been no adaptations made. In coming up with these figures, I did look at the number of disabled facilities grants that were basically delayed, and there were tens of thousands, if not close to 100,000 situations where that was the case as well. So I think, as I say, that's a reasonable number. And then another one in terms of unreasonable to continue to occupy is damp and mould. I'm sure you all heard of the Awabashat case a few years ago now, where a toddler died because of the effects of damp and mould on his breathing. But effectively, the law is that having damp and mould does not make you homeless unless it is having an impact on your health, a significant impact on your health. And so although the figures I came across here on the internet were between 1 and 6 million properties were affected by damp and mould, there was only something like 13,500 cases where asthma and lower respiratory breathing issues, I can't remember the actual technical term for it, had arisen from the damp and mould. But it does say in that article that the actual real figures could be between 3 and 8 times higher. So if we multiply that number by 3, already multiplying it by 2.2 in terms of the number of households, in terms of the average size of household, we're looking at a figure of something like 87,000. That would be a conservative figure, I think. There is the issue of category 1 hazards, which I genuinely don't know at what point leads someone to be homeless. There obviously is a point where if you've got category 1 hazards in your home, I mean damp and mould would be one of them actually, but where that would result in a finding that you're homeless. And I was shocked that nearly 2 million households in 2022 in England had a category 1 hazard in it. So that would be like, in terms of the actual number of people affected by that, you're looking at over 4 million. But as I say, because I don't know how the law works around this, and as I say, what point you become homeless, I'm just going to leave this particular figure out altogether. We've already kind of covered some of it with damp and mould anyway. I will talk about overlap in general because there will be overlap between these different figures as we go through. And then finally, just looking at the number of unauthorised caravans in England. So it's a relatively small number compared to these other numbers we've just been discussing. The official number is just over 3,500. Again, average household size 2.2. If we multiply that, we get 8,000. I would imagine that's a conservative number. Again, plausibly, it's probably going to be more like 10,000 or whatever. And then that brings us to this kind of total. So if we were to tally up all the figures I've just gone through, that and kind of looked at all the conservative numbers to start off with, we're looking at over 3 million people would be legally homeless according to the definition under the Housing Act 1996. And the plausible figures I use would give a figure of over 5 million. Now, we need to talk about overlap at this point because you'll often find these kinds of issues overlap massively. So, for example, if you're in overcrowded accommodation, lots of people breathing or whatever, they're going to be more likely to be damp and mould. You're probably more likely to have people with disabilities in those types of accommodation because by nature of their disability, they have less spending power to have choice about where they live, if nothing else. You would imagine that those kind of environments would lead to a high risk of domestic abuse. So there's obviously kind of quite a lot of overlap between the different numbers. For example, a lot of people in temporary accommodation will actually be affected by damp and mould. So yeah, again, that's going to be something where we overlap. But if we take that conservative figure of just over 3 million and we halve it, just to kind of account for those overlaps, that would give us this figure of 1.5 million that I've put at the beginning of the video. You can see how clumsy it is, but I'm hoping you can see the maths that underpin that figure is based in reality in some way. I'm sure someone could probably come along and say, actually, that's wrong for X, Y and Z reason and refine it. But I think that gives us a ballpark figure. It's certainly a lot more than most people would think, when you ask them how many people might be homeless. So I don't know if it's stating the obvious to say, but if you've got 1.5 million or 2.5 million people in England who are legally homeless, that is a very large number of people whose entire ability to contribute to society, to pay tax, is massively thwarted by just their living conditions. And it seems to me that living conditions is absolutely within our power to do something about. It's absolutely possible to build more homes. It's absolutely possible to drive up standards within existing accommodation, many of which have kind of natural boost to the economy as well. And although it's kind of stated that it's really expensive to build lots of homes, I would say with these kind of figures, when you've got this many people being taken out of being economically active, surely it's got to actually cost a huge amount on our country to not do so, to essentially allow them to continue living in those conditions. That's not to mention the number of professionals whose entire job is to deal with the effects of this housing crisis on people by helping people navigate the bureaucracy, by helping people sign on and dealing with health and well-being issues that arise from these kind of poor living conditions. And so it seems to me that should those 1.5 or 2.5 million people think politically, organise in some way, they could massively drive up standards. There's also some bigger picture things. So if you watch a channel called Gary's Economics, who's an ex kind of high-flying banker, who talks about the economics of inequality, there's a lot to be said for just kind of realising how big an issue this is, and for people being affected by it to actually become more political, to engage with their local councillors, to go and see their MPs, even if it's just literally to tell them what's happening, that will have a positive impact. So when you do see these figures reported in the press, I mean, we're about to have another kind of update on the number of people sleeping rough in England, and there'll be all these charities and kind of media organisations talking about this figure of 4 or 5,000. Just bear in mind that is the tip of the iceberg. There are hundreds of thousands, probably a couple of million people more, whose entire lives are thwarted by this poor housing conditions and homelessness in that legal definition of the word. And I guess it's probably worth saying as well, when the Conservative government enacted this legislation back in 1996 and then amended it in Localism Act 2011, Homelessness Reduction Act 2017, Domestic Abuse Act 2021, they recognise the damage that it does to society. That's why they put these laws in place. It's not because they're trying to be nice. They realise that having this number of people who are economically inactive as a result of their housing conditions is just bad for the country, bad for our country's future, and is something that can be solved essentially just with money, or money and a little bit of political will. Whereas some of the other issues facing us as a country, it's a lot more difficult. You know, how do you deal with the mental health crisis among children? I don't really know. Having good housing is one thing you can do about that.